South Korea and New Zealand celebrated the 60th anniversary of diplomatic ties this year, but the relationship dates back further to the Korean War, when some 6,000 New Zealanders served in support of United Nations Command, fighting alongside the South. The two countries now enjoy exchanges on a diverse range of fields, from the economy to culture. To give us an insight into the relationship, we are delighted to welcome to the studio for this week's Touch Base in Seoul the New Zealand ambassador to South Korea and North Korea concurrently, Philip Turner. Ambassador Turner, thank you for stopping by today.
Thank you. It's a great honour and privilege to be here.
So, Ambassador, you started your role as ambassador in South Korea in March 2018, so 4 years have passed now. How have you found your time in Korea?
Oh, it's been fantastic. It's already, as you say, 4 years into my fifth year. That's quite long for New Zealand, but I've had a couple of extensions, and I'm delighted by that. I really, really have enjoyed Korea, love being here, and I'm in no hurry to go home.
You'd served in postings in Asia, such as Japan and China, before Korea, so I'm sure you would have been familiar with South Korea, but still, what was your a picture of Korea before you came as ambassador, and has that changed over the years?
Well, I have a slightly unusual background for an ambassador in that I spent 18 years in business before coming here. I started as an ambassador, as a diplomat initially for New Zealand, and then left after about 12 years and joined Fonterra, which is a very large New Zealand company selling dairy products, milk and cheese and butter. And with Fonterra, spent a lot of time in Japan and China and even in Korea, coming and going. And that was as a businessman on a commercial basis. So this part of the world is pretty familiar. And I knew a fair bit about Korea already, but had never lived here. But my first visit to Korea was 1991, I think, as a brief tourist weekend here. And gee, things have changed since then. It's just astounding, how much the country has transformed in that short time that I've known it. Back then, it was a very different city. My visual image of Seoul was it was quite flat, that it was relatively low-rise, 3, 4, 5-story buildings mostly. Of course, now it's 40, 50, 60-story buildings everywhere.
Sure. So a lot has changed since the first time you came. Living here, though, has it been okay adapting to the culture? Were there any difficulties at all?
No, not really. I mean, I love it here. The food is fantastic. The people are very welcoming. Having spent a lot of time in China and Japan, this kind of completes the triangle for me for North Asia. So it's enormously satisfying to be here. As
I mentioned at the beginning, what's interesting is that you're not only New Zealand's ambassador to South Korea, but also North Korea as well. Is that usual?
It's usual for New Zealand, and there's nearly 20 countries, I think, which do cover North Korea from here in Seoul. In our case, we've been doing this for some time, but it's relatively meaningless at the moment, honestly, because there's so little contact and little dialogue between us. Because for many years now, as you know, as your listeners will be very aware, Korea has been developing its weapons of mass destruction, missiles, ballistic missiles, nuclear weapons, and abusing human rights. So that's made it very difficult for us to have any real contact with North Korea. Of course, we strongly support the efforts of the South Korean government to build peace and prosperity on the peninsula. But it's a very difficult situation at the moment, and I have unfortunately not been able to visit myself. And we haven't had any contact to speak of with North Korea for some time.
Right, so it is an interesting position you're in, where you are ambassador for North Korea, but you're serving in South Korea, but you've not been able to go, especially because of the situation with the pandemic, I'm guessing.
Well, that certainly has made it impossible for everybody to visit, as you know, in the last 2 years. But even before then, with the exception of the brief period of détente under President Moon Jae-in, North Korea has been behaving pretty badly for some time. And it's hard to justify to the people of New Zealand trying to build a relationship by physically going to Pyongyang at a time when they are endangering the peace and security of the region through their own weapons testing and human rights abuses.
Sure. Well, let's move on to another interesting fact about you, Ambassador, before we move on to the South Korea-New Zealand relationship, because It's understood that you are the first openly gay ambassador to South Korea, with your same-sex spouse officially recognised by the South Korean government. In fact, back in 2019, I believe you and your partner were also invited by President Moon to a reception for diplomats at the Cheongwade, the presidential office at the time. So you are a bit of a history maker, a trailblazer, should we say. What did it mean to you to have that recognition here in South Korea?
It was hugely important, both to me and my partner Hiroshi personally, but I think also to New Zealand, and I hope to some extent to Koreans also. You know, we were able to persuade the Korean government under President Moon to accept same-sex diplomats on the same basis as married straight diplomats for the first time, and that was quite a breakthrough, as you say. Since then, I'm delighted to see that among my colleagues in the diplomatic corps, there are now several other gay ambassadors with same-sex spouses fully recognised by the Korean government, and numerous other diplomatic staff here who've been able to come here because of this change in the Korean regulations. So it's very meaningful, and we're very humbled and in a way privileged to be able to be part of that. And being able to go with my partner Hiroshi and to meet President Moon and the First Lady at Cheongwade, the old Blue House, at the reception in 2019 was very moving. The President and the First Lady were both very gracious to us and very supportive.
You've also taken part in events here in Korea celebrating diversity, such as this whole Queer Culture Festival. How important is it for you personally to share those messages of diversity and inclusion as an ambassador? Important
personally, but also important to New Zealand, to my government. Diversity, gender rights, women's rights, minority rights generally are a key part of our human rights policy. So it's not just about me, it's that this is part of what New Zealand stands for. We have a long and, I would hope, pioneering tradition of supporting social reform. You know, in New Zealand, we were the first country to have where women could vote, the first country to introduce old age pensions, for example. So even though many of these issues have involved a lot of struggle over time by a lot of very dedicated people, New Zealand has mostly been at the forefront of pushing forward a human rights agenda around diversity, women's rights, and so on. And this continues with the LGBT movement today. So we're very pleased to be part of that. And now, for example, just next month, we've got Seoul Pride, as you will know, here in Korea. We and many other embassies proactively participate to support diversity in Korea. And this year we're hosting a large reception on the Friday night before the Pride event with, I hope, one or 200 people, just to show our support for diversity and the principles of tolerance, equality, and diversity. So a very important aspect that New Zealand has led the way, and you are representing that here in South Korea as well. Let's talk more about the New Zealand-South Korea relationship more broadly. As we said, the two countries are celebrating 60 years of diplomatic ties. How would you describe the relationship during that time? Well, it was kind of forged in blood, if you like, through the Korean War, which is an unfortunate way to start a relationship. But as you mentioned, some 6,000 New Zealanders participated in the Korean War. And since then, the relationship has enormously developed. We still have New Zealanders on the ground here. We have 12 Kiwis here serving with the United Nations Command to support the armistice and peace on the peninsula. And that shows, I think, that New Zealand sees Korea as definitely part of the same region. But the relationship has enormously developed in trade, investment, tourism, education, people-to-people flows. Just to give you one example, nearly 1% of the New Zealand population are now Korean-born or Korean origin. Oh, interesting. So we had quite a wave of immigration in the 1990s, 2000s, and now there's 37,000 Korean origin folk who call New Zealand home. So it's a large proportion of the population and a fantastic resource. So we have all sorts of young people who speak New Zealand English and Korean, feel comfortable in both cultures, and travel, between both countries, between two labour markets, and their families are often split between the two countries.
Right, and another key relationship, of course, is in trade. South Korea is now New Zealand's fifth largest export market, and New Zealand has also seen a successful growth of exports to South Korea. What opportunities do you see for South Korea and New Zealand ahead as well?
The trade relationship is building very well. We have a free trade agreement which was signed in 2015, and we're now starting to see the benefits of that. So listeners can appreciate this in their own supermarkets. Every time you go and buy a bottle of New Zealand wine or some kiwi fruit from New Zealand, you are enjoying zero tariffs at the border for the first time.
Sure, and both delicious as well, I've got to say.
Thank you. Well, and wine sales have actually boomed in the last year. New Zealand is the fastest growing source of wine into Korea. And those opportunities are made possible by the free trade agreement. So now we can sell kiwi fruit to Korean consumers for a 0% tariff, whereas before it was 43% or 45%. But we also have the New Zealand company Zespri grows kiwi fruit in Korea. Right. So that enables them to provide same quality kiwi fruit to Korean consumers all year round, irrespective of the winter or summer growing seasons.
Sure, and the prospects for the future seem good as well. There are trade deals, wider trade deals and agreements that South Korea and New Zealand are involved in now, including RCEP. South Korea is looking to join the CPTPP as well. Both have agreed recently on the newly launched Indo-Pacific Economic Framework led by the US as well. So things are looking good.
There are a lot of acronyms out there, aren't there? And people get confused. But basically, you're right. RCEP is a big and important agreement among many countries in Asia. We're very keen to see Korea join CPTPP because this is a step up again in terms of market access. And unfortunately, the United States has so far decided not to join, which is a pity. But we think Korea, as the 10th largest economy in the world and a major trading partner, deserves to be, should be in there and should be leading the way forward for the region in terms of continuing to liberalize and strengthen trade rules at this time when we have global inflation, food insecurity, supply chain challenges. We think it's all the more important that trading countries like Korea and New Zealand work to strengthen and defend the rules that we have that make that trade possible.
And of course, in culture as well, I'm sure K-pop is seeing its popularity in New Zealand as well.
It really is. We have just had K-pop festivals in Auckland and Wellington. We had a New Zealand K-pop team who participated in Changwon in Korea in the global K-pop competition recently. And look, I had the pleasure myself, unexpectedly, of appearing in a K-pop video just this month.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes, that's right. I think one of Korea's most prominent out gay entertainers, Hong Sok-jeon, has put together his first music video. And he very unexpectedly asked Hiroshi, my partner, and me to join in the music video, and we just dance in the background while he sings and other things happen. But that video just came out 2 weeks ago and is already, I think, doing quite well on the net. So that was an unexpected part of being an ambassador here in Korea.
I'm sure it was. I'll have to look out for that as well. Finally, then, looking ahead, as we said, 60 years we've had. How do you see the next 60 years developing for the bilateral relationship?
Look, honestly, it's really hard to say. Who would have thought that Korea would be where it is today, looking back 60 years? 60 years ago, 1962. Look, I'll tell you a story. My family were Catholic. Growing up in New Zealand, we had very little money, but they would give money every month to a charity, a Catholic charity, which sponsored kids in Korea who were very, very poor, much poorer than we were. And my parents continued to give money to them for 20 years. And now I look at that and think, crikey, I wonder where that family is. They may well be much richer than my family are now. So, I pay tribute to the progress that's been made in Korea during that time. And given that enormous change, I find it really hard to imagine what lies ahead for Korea and New Zealand in the next 60 years.
Sure, I'm sure it will continue to flourish. We'll have to leave it there. We've been speaking to New Zealand's ambassador to South Korea and North Korea, Philip Turner. Thank you once again for your time today.
Thanks very much.